How's it going, everybody? Welcome to my channel. Today, I'm going to be going over the history of the African American struggle in America and how it has been intertwined over party lines. I'm your host, Brad CGZ, and this is a post-jury flurry of logical faction. For the majority of my life, one of the main topics of discussion pertaining to the political world is how to help the black community rise to prosperity. Now, for many years on many different mediums, the main narrative when pertaining to the community is how it's gotten progressively worse. More people on welfare, less money, less jobs, and so on. But there was a time when things were getting progressively better for the black community. And I thought maybe we'd take a look at that and the situation in general from a historical angle to see what has changed and to see if possibly it could shed some light on how to bring back a forward progression rather than a backward one. And also maybe dispel some of the blatant lies I've seen pushed in the media over the years. The timeline starts, of course, with the newly freed black populace in 1863, but really 1865 at the end of the war. Now, a few years later, in 1868, the 14th Amendment would give black Americans full citizenship, and in 1870, they are also granted the right to vote. Following the gaining of citizenship in 1868 and the right to vote in 1870, over the next few decades, the black community then begins voting members into Congress, and really, things appear to be on a forward progression. So for a bit there, things were in a steady incline. Obviously, a lot of people had to constantly fight for these things. By no stretch of the imagination was it all sunshine and rainbows. Those were as rough as times could get for a lot of people, not just black. The world overall was pretty tough in the 1800s and early 1900s. But as far as the black populace was concerned, you're talking about some major leaps forward, especially considering where they were in just the 1860s. But then, as the new century gets underway, a shift begins to occur starting in the 30s and really taking shape in the 60s. Now, the question I want to ask is, what's been the difference between then and now? And I'll start with the simple answer before I get into it, but one of the major differences is that for the past 60 years, the black community has voted nearly exclusively Democrat. If you look at this chart here, you can see that starting in 1964, the black vote spikes to over 90%. We could also see why I stated that it had technically started in the 30s. Now, many historians like to point to charts like this and state that the black vote started to change, just not as much, back in the 1930s, which, to the naked eye, this chart appears to suggest. What they don't tell you is that FDR won the 1936 election 523 electoral votes to 8. So everybody voted overwhelmingly Democrat that year, making the years on this chart a bit of a wash. You got to take into account that this was the Depression era and everyone was dependent on the government to survive at this time. They felt they had to vote FDR or starve. This is a powerful dynamic that did not go unnoticed. These are the years that showed them the power of having large swaths of the public on government dependency programs. Now, 40 and 44 were FDR again, 48 was his vice president, Truman, and after 52, you can see Republican support start to jump back up. So it did start in the 30s, yes, technically, but the whole country had gone that way, not just the black community. So it's not a great gauge. We're making 1964 the real switchover when the black community began overwhelmingly voting strictly Democrat. And what I would like to look at in this video is what has happened since this shift from Republican to Democrat. Now, right now, 66% of African Americans are born to single mothers. In 1960, only 22% of African Americans were born to single mothers. The incarceration rate of African Americans in 1960 was about 1,300 out of 100,000. Now it's 4,300 out of 100,000. You could thank Bill Clinton for this huge jump after signing his and really Joe Biden's 1994 crime bill, which sent already rising incarceration numbers to record highs and ravaged all poor communities at that. So what else happened? What changed in the 60s? The parties didn't change. Republicans have always been for smaller government and less taxes. The Democrats have always been for bigger government and more taxes. Yet anytime someone brings up the Democrats' crazy racist past, they emphatically tell you that, well, the party switched in the 60s, which again is a lie. The Democrats have always been for bigger government and higher taxes. It was a Democrat, Woodrow Wilson, who signed the Federal Reserve Act in 1913, which basically enslaved our country to a debt monetary scam. Woodrow Wilson, also in 1913, ratified the 16th Amendment, which stated that Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes on incomes from whatever source derived, without apportionment among the several states and without regard to any census or enumeration. Wilson's top advisor, Edward Mandell House, started the Council on Foreign Relations, which has basically taken over our government. In 1934, FDR's New Deal for Crime contained the National Firearms Act, aka the first official gun control law since the Second Amendment was added in 1791 by the Democrats in the 30s. So they are the exact same Democrats they have always been. They have always been for more government control, they have always been for higher taxes, and they have always been for disarmament. While the Republicans have always fought them for the Second Amendment, less government, and lower taxes. The parties are exactly the same they've always been. But what changed in the 60s that began this decline that ramped up incarceration, children born out of wedlock, and crime? I mean, after all, Martin Luther King was a Republican. Well, it was in the 60s that Lyndon Johnson, Democrat, ramped up the welfare state, which on its face seemed like a good thing. However, if they would have read this government document from 1954 titled Silent Weapons for Quiet Wars, they would have seen that the welfare state was detailed as a way to enslave the poor while also crippling the middle class. And it's done exactly this. Ever since the welfare state was ramped up in the 60s, the poor have been locked into their situation. Just enough money to survive, but never enough to get ahead. Government dependency. Now fast forward now to 1994, where Clinton, a Democrat, signs NAFTA, which lost millions of agricultural jobs and began the exodus of manufacturing jobs. After that, the remaining manual labor jobs were flooded with low-wage illegals, therefore making it impossible to get a regular hands-on job out of high school, earn a decent wage, and move to a middle-class neighborhood. Now they've made it so you have to go to college to even think of earning a livable wage. So sure, welfare would drop off in 96 due to welfare reform, but the damage was already done and a new form of government dependency was already being put in place anyway. Also, the mass incarceration that came with the creation of the welfare state would continue to rise anyway due to the 1994 Clinton-Biden crime bill, crippling poor communities of all colors. Even then, the very few impoverished students who do go to college have to take on loans, so once they're finally done and are ready to get a job, they're starting their life in their mid-20s with 50 grand in debt. Debt that belongs to the government, thanks to Obama, Democrat, making all student loans government-run in 2010, and you cannot erase that debt even in bankruptcy. Obama did that to us. You're chained to government for life, either by going on welfare because there are no more blue-collar jobs, or by going to college and owing them essentially a mortgage. It used to be, before all this, you'd finish high school, or not, and you'd go work at a factory or construction or somewhere with your hands and make a decent living. Now that option barely exists. They either have all been sent overseas or taken up by undocumented workers for a fraction of the pay. The only option, again, is to take out absurd student loans and delay your entering the workforce by 4 years. That's crippling. So what happens? Where in the 60s, most would get a blue-collar job, now only a few can. For the majority, there are 3 options. Go to a life of crime, which thanks to the 1994 crime bill and the precedent that set is almost a certain direct path to jail. You could take on the albatross of a student loan chaining you to the government for life, or you can go on welfare. Democrats have systematically destroyed your neighborhoods, and all poor neighborhoods for that matter. And I hear people all the time blame the Republicans for the state of things. How would you even know? You haven't voted one in to run your neighborhoods in half a century. And what was the theme before these past 60 years when black Americans were voting Republican? Rising out of slavery, rising in the community, and rising in the government. I'll elaborate. The first one we all know. The president who freed the slaves, Abraham Lincoln, was a Republican. This should not be a surprise. The Republican Party was founded from an offshoot group of Whigs who had broken off because they wanted to end slavery. The Republican Party was literally started by a group of anti-slavery abolitionist Whigs. Moving on, the party who gave blacks the right to vote were the Republicans, with a vote of 100% Republican support and 0% Democratic support, similar to the vote to make freed slaves official citizens of the United States, which had 94% Republican support and, again, 0% Democratic support. The first black senator, Hiram Revels, in 1870 was a Republican. In fact, every black senator up until 1993 was a Republican. The first black congressman was also a Republican. Furthermore, the first 21 black congressmen were Republicans. The Republicans even had the first black Speaker of the House in 1874, Joseph Hayne Rainey. That's right, the Speaker of the House in 1874 was black. Shh, don't tell Hollywood. Right? These are the things being purposely left out of the history books and the leftist media. Now, during Rainey's time in Congress, he supported legislation to protect the civil rights of Southern black people, even getting the Civil Rights Act of 1875 passed. At the same time, Rainey and the Republicans were passing that act, the Democrats were using their military arm called the Red Shirts to suppress black voting. Sound familiar? Democrats used these paramilitary groups to intimidate Republican voters while simultaneously passing laws to make it difficult for blacks and all poor people, for that matter, to vote. Now, this is historically referred to as the disenfranchisement era. The Democrats throughout the early 1900s passed laws to strip black people of political power, and it worked. After so many black Republicans had made their way to Congress, finally giving them a voice in this country, this worked to eventually exclude them from the political process for the few decades leading up to the 60s. That's the Democrats who destroyed all that. All the progress that was being made. So this is your so-called transition period where they claim the parties were, quote, switching sides, even though, as we just went over, their policies are exactly the same as they have always been. Big government, big taxes, and disarmament. But these are the years where they were supposedly switching. The decades where Democrats had completely snuffed out all black Republicans from Congress through racist legislature. Now, some of these laws included the 8-box law, which was basically a series of technicalities to disqualify votes, which they essentially used to just remove any votes they wished. In the early 1900s, members of the Democratic Party in some southern states made it illegal for blacks to vote in the primaries, which, they'll just vote in the re-election. But being that the two biggest candidates were usually both Democrats, the primaries essentially were the real elections. So now, some blacks had no say in who ran their state. The Democrats introduced poll taxes, which ensured that most poor people, black and white, couldn't afford to vote, amongst many other laws. They also, aside from the voting booths, added other laws to further demoralize the black community during these years, such as Jim Crow laws. All this is the Democrats. They then created violent anti-black groups such as the Ku Klux Klan. Now, here's a picture of the 1924 DNC. This is the Democratic National Convention, all right? And just 8 years earlier, in 1916, a Democrat, Margaret Sanger, founded Planned Parenthood in Brooklyn. And according to the Wall Street Journal, she is quoted as saying, "We don't want the word to get out that we want to exterminate the Negro population." Now, this is someone Hillary Clinton, who most of you probably voted for in 2016, has said she admires enormously and is in awe of. This is who every Democratic vote fights for, Planned Parenthood. Democrats are even fighting right now in some states to legalize full-term abortion, infanticide. But try and look up any of this, and here are the Democratic fact-checkers to the rescue. How can you fact-check your own people? I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of people in Rikers right now that would like to be put in charge of fact-checking their convictions before they get sent upstate. But try to look this up, and here's an article by factcheck.org that states, Sanger says that a minister could debunk the notion, if it arose, that clinics aim to exterminate the Negro population. She didn't say that she wanted to exterminate the black population. Oh, well, case closed. Nothing to see here, right? Well, here's the full quote. The minister's work is also important, and he should be trained, perhaps by the Federation, as to our ideals and the goal that we hope to reach. We do not want word to go out that we want to exterminate the Negro population, and the minister is the man who can straighten out that idea if it ever occurs to any of their more rebellious members. All right? So she didn't say that we don't want them to think we want to exterminate the Negro population. She said we don't want word to get out that we want to exterminate the Negro population. They want to try and spin that? That's fine. But numbers don't lie. And since Roe v. Wade was passed in 1973, 19 million black babies have been aborted, which would make up a third of your current population. Snuffed out before even getting a chance. It's the number one cause of death in the black community by a mile. Yet, you vote for Democrats who praise Margaret Sanger, who started Planned Parenthood specifically to exterminate your race. That's her words, not mine. And they're doing exactly that to all the poor. So in summation, it is a matter of record that following the freeing of the slaves in 1865, Republicans were forced to battle the Democrats for 100 years as they tried over and over to destroy the black community, until the 1960s when the Democrats finally found a new way. Instead of fighting the black community and the Republicans head on, they instead hijacked the community and said, oh no, we're for you guys now. Despite the fact that the very president at that time, President Johnson, was quoted as saying, I'll have those N-words voting Democrat for the next 200 years. And that's what Johnson did. He said, look, we're in favor of the civil rights movement. Here, we'll even sign this Poverty Act to build up the welfare system for you. They're the people you were fighting in the first place. All they had to do was stop. They didn't have to sign crippling legislature, but no. Instead, they better organized and ramped up the welfare system, conveniently failing to mention that they already had plans to build up the welfare system in writing as far back as 1954, not mentioning that its, quote, main purpose was to imprison the poor communities and chain them to government for life, while also dragging down the middle class so there's nowhere to go for them anyway. And since that time, the rate of black babies being born to single mothers has gone from 22% to 66%. The rate of blacks being incarcerated has risen from 1,300 out of 100,000 to 4,300 out of 100,000. That's a pretty consistent track record if you ask me. First, the Democrats opposed freeing the slaves. Then after the war, they opposed giving freed blacks citizenship. Then they opposed giving blacks the right to vote. Then they made laws to make it harder for blacks to vote. Then they made the Ku Klux Klan. Then they sold us out to the bank cartels. Then they ramped up taxes. Then they passed separate but equal Jim Crow laws. Then they created the welfare state. Then they flooded the country with illegals, taking all the blue-collar jobs away. Then they signed NAFTA, sending the rest of the non-college-ready jobs away. And in 1994, passed a crime bill that excelled the police state. So yeah, I can't figure out why on earth any person of color, or anyone for that matter, would vote Democrat. I don't know. It's beyond me. And then you can't even have a conversation about this stuff. The liberal media's got everyone so on edge these days. You go to say anything about it and then, oh, you're immediately called a racist. All cards on the table. If I was a racist, I would tell you to vote Democrat for the rest of your life. By all means. Do you want to keep voting these pariahs in and continue to destroy your communities? Go right ahead. But for what it's worth, I'd rather if you didn't. Thank you, and good night.
And Madam President, we have predators on our streets that society has, in fact, in part because of its neglect, created. Again, it does not mean because we created them that we somehow forgive them or do not take them out of society to protect my family and yours from them. They are beyond the pale, many of those people. I don't care why someone is a malfactor in society. I don't care why someone is antisocial. I don't care why they've become a sociopath. We have an obligation to cordon them off from the rest of society, try to help them, try to change their behavior. That's why we do in this bill. We have drug treatment and we have other treatments to try to deal with it. But they are in jail.